Hi, everybody. Welcome to the webinar. Happy Election Day. We're glad that you could take some time out of your busy day of working and hopefully voting to join us for this 45-minute webinar. It's based on findings from a working paper we recently released on our website. I'll put that information in the Q&A for you so that you can see it. My good colleagues, Umit Ozic, a senior economist at RAND, and Lauren Cavelli, an associate policy researcher, did the bulk of the analysis on that paper. These findings are based on nationally representative data from several principal and teacher surveys we've fielded over the past 2 years through the American Mathematics Educator Study, which I'll talk about in a moment. So let me introduce the folks in the room that I'm really honored to be presenting with today. I'll start with myself. My name is Julia Kaufman. I'm a senior policy researcher at RAND. I lead the American Mathematics Educator Study with my colleagues Elizabeth Steiner and David Grant. I also co-direct the American Educator Panels, which are the largest educator panels of their kind in the US, providing national and state representative data on K-12 public school educators across the US. Let me introduce my colleague, Lauren Cavelli. She's an associate policy researcher at RAND, and she leads a lot of the quantitative analysis for the American Mathematics Educator Study. Her research uses quantitative methods to evaluate the impacts of K-12 education policies, and her recent work covers topics such as school choice, college entrance exams, school finance, and accountability policy. And she'll present some of those key findings from that working paper today. Then we have two esteemed guests with us today that I'm really excited that will be serving as discussants for the work we're presenting. We have Sean Doherty. He's a professor of education and policy at Boston College's Lynch School of Education and Human Development. His work focuses on education policy analysis, causal program evaluation, and the economics of education. He's currently also on leave from Boston College, working as a senior advisor at the U.S. Department of Education. We really appreciate him taking time out of his busy schedule to join us. Thank you, Sean. We also have Dan Goldhaber. He's the director of the Center for Analysis of Longitudinal Data in Education Research at the American Institutes for Research, and the director of the Center for Education Data and Research at the University of Washington. Both of those centers are focused on using state administrative data to do research that informs decisions about policy and practice. Dan is also a key member of the research team who advised on this working paper, and we just deeply appreciate him joining us today to share his perspective on our data. So here's an agenda in the brief 45 minutes that you have with us today. First, I'll give a brief overview of the American Mathematics Educator Study from which these data came and the RAND survey panels. Then I'll pass it over to Lauren. She'll talk about the key findings on factors that are associated with differences in algebra teaching and learning experiences in 8th and 9th grade. And lastly, I'll turn it over to our panelists, and we will have some time at the end for a brief Q&A. If you do have questions in the course of our discussion, please feel free to post them in the Q&A. We can try to answer them live if possible, or just answer them in the Q&A feature. So do ask questions. It'll help us to engage with you and answer to any confusion you might have. So let me start by giving you an overview of our study. So first, let me talk about the panels on which this study is run. So RAND runs 6 survey panels. 2 of them have data that we'll talk about today, the American Teacher Panel and the American School Leader Panel. We also have an American School District Panel. These are panels of thousands of educators that are selected through probability-based methods to serve on these panels and agree to be surveyed periodically. We also have other panels that are part of RAND. We have a household panel called the American Life Panel, and we have 2 newer panels, the American Youth Panel and the American Parents Panel. Together, these panels give us a lot of data on what's happening across the United States that's really policy relevant and helps us answer critical policy questions. So panelists in all these panels are selected through stratified random samples to reflect the diversity of the country. So today, for example, we'll be talking about responses from public school principals and public school teachers. These are people who are randomly selected to represent, respectively, K-12 public school principals and teachers across the nation, both in terms of the demographics in the schools in which they serve and their own levels of experience and training. Importantly, after we collect our data, where we've selected these people for each survey, We then weight responses to provide nationally representative estimates. And that's an important part of the process, of course, because it accounts for the fact that some people, some groups may respond less than others to our survey. And so we weight them up to ensure that they are nationally representative of all teachers and principals. And importantly, we are proud members of the American Association of Public Opinion Research's Transparency Initiative, which means that we have committed to making our data, methods, and findings available to the public for free. We are proud of the rigor with which we do our research, and we provide information about our approaches transparently to you all, so you can trust our approach and findings. So let me talk about the American Mathematics Educator Study for a moment. This is a study that includes surveys that are fielded annually. They were 2 surveys, one to principals and one to teachers, fielded this past spring, as well as the spring before, 2023, for the American Mathematics Educator Study. This includes national samples of teachers of mathematics, including elementary teachers of all subjects, and K through 12 public school leaders. We also have oversamples of school leaders and teachers in California, Florida, New York, and Texas. We don't talk about those oversamples today, but we have them as part of our data and we have reported on them. AIMS will be fielded in spring 2025, 2026, and 2027 as well. Okay, now we'll move to some results from this particular paper. Before I turn it over to Lauren, I'm just going to give a little bit of background that serves as a motivation for this paper. So we know from many, many studies that taking algebra in 8th grade is associated with a range of positive outcomes. That includes students who take and pass advanced math courses in high school and college, as well as it's predictive of students persisting through college and enjoying higher earnings through post-high school. So a lot of positive outcomes. That said, a lot of studies have also identified disparities in who gets to enroll in and pass algebra in 8th grade. For example, the US Department of Education noted a few years ago that nationwide 28% of white students took algebra in 8th grade and 25% passed, whereas the enrollment and completion for Black or African-American students was only 16% enrollment and 13% passing. So there are these deep disparities. Many districts and some states have tried interventions to improve enrollment and completion rates in algebra, including universal algebra, double dose algebra, automatic enrollment in algebra for higher performing students, with some levels of success. But to complement these efforts, this study just offers a national picture of classroom, teacher, and school level factors associated with algebra course taking, and just gives you an idea of which students are getting more high quality math learning opportunities. So now I'm going to pass it over to Lauren, who's going to talk about our key findings.
All right, great, thanks. Okay, so I want to start by giving a preview of the 4 key findings that I'm going to walk us through today. First, we find that the highest poverty schools are significantly less likely to offer algebra in 8th grade to all students or offer it at all. Next, we find that compared to principals in low poverty schools, principals in the highest poverty schools are less likely to use parent requests, teacher referrals, and prior course grades when making placement decisions about what students can take which courses. Next, we look at how teacher characteristics vary by the proportion of students in poverty in a school. And we find that math teachers in the highest poverty schools are about 3 times more likely to have an alternative certification and are less likely to have completed student teaching as part of their preparation program. And finally, we look at how instructional time is spent in math classrooms. And we find that teachers in the highest poverty schools are spending more time teaching below grade level topics, lecturing, doing tests and quizzes, and spending more time on discipline. So we will take a closer look at the data behind each of these 4 findings in more detail. But first, I wanted to provide a brief overview of our methods just to give a little context on exactly what we're looking at when we look to the data. All right, so as Julia said, we have 2 years worth of nationally representative data on math teachers and principals across grades K to 12. So for the purposes of this study, we start by limiting our teacher sample to those who teach either 8th or 9th grade math. And we then limit the principal sample to principals of schools covering those grades, principals of schools with 8th or 9th grade. Then we use a measure of poverty created by the Urban Institute to categorize schools into quartiles of the proportion of students in that school that are living in poverty. So what that means for interpretation of our results is that when we say highest poverty as compared to lowest poverty, we're comparing the top 25% of schools with the largest enrollment of impoverished students to the bottom 25% of schools with the lowest enrollment of impoverished students. We then use regression analysis to compare averages across schools with higher and lower shares of students living in poverty. And finally, we add controls to our models for the state that the school is located in, the urbanicity of the school, the size of the school, and the racial and ethnic composition of the school to check if the differences that we see by poverty may be largely explained by these other factors that we know tend to be correlated with the proportion of students living in poverty. And as a quick note, in the full paper, we also look at all of these trends by the proportion of students enrolled that are either Black or Hispanic, as well as looking at the state representative oversamples in the 3 largest states. So we show some results for California, Florida, and Texas specifically. Today, we're just highlighting some of the key findings we found for poverty, but there are a lot more results available if you're interested in those in the full paper. All right. Okay, so our first key finding, on the left here, we see that the highest poverty schools, which are in blue, are 12 percentage points less likely to offer 8th grade algebra unconditionally as compared to the lowest poverty schools, which are represented by the green bars. On the right, we see that almost a quarter of the highest poverty schools report that they are not offering 8th grade algebra at all, as compared to only 6% of the lowest poverty schools. So that's an 18 percentage point difference in whether or not algebra is offered in 8th grade. Okay, so then we also ask principals that if their students are grouped by achievement for math instruction, what information do you use to group students by achievement? And we find that principals of high and low poverty schools are using data sources differently, or at least are using different data sources to make those decisions. Principals in the highest poverty schools are significantly less likely to use all 4 of these types of information for placement decisions as compared to the principals of lowest poverty schools. So that includes the principal's own knowledge of the student, parent requests, teacher referrals, and prior course grades. And while it's not necessarily a good or bad thing if any one of these data sources is taken into consideration, I think that we can certainly make the case for both the cost and benefits of more and less objective and subjective measures used to make these decisions. I think a main takeaway from what we're seeing here is that principals in lower poverty schools seem to be using a larger portfolio of information when making placement decisions than principals in higher poverty schools. All right, and we also look into the types of preparation that math teachers have, and we find some large differences by student poverty. We find that teachers in the highest poverty schools are 18 percentage points more likely to have completed an alternative certification program as compared to a traditional preparation program, and are also much less likely to have had graduate level training, have had experienced student teaching, or hold a single subject math credential as the type of certification that they have. All right, and finally, we look at the instructional activities that are happening within the classroom. And what this chart shows is the proportion of teachers that are reporting that they spend at least 50% of their instructional time on each of these types of activities. So we see that math teachers in the highest poverty schools are much more likely to be spending time addressing math topics that are below grade level, providing math instruction verbally, doing tests and quizzes in their classrooms, and they're spending more time disciplining students. So we kind of have framed our approach to this paper as first thinking about what courses are offered, and then when those courses are offered, which students have access to them. When those courses are offered, which students or which teachers are teaching them, and then within those classrooms, what did the actual instructional activities look like? So with that said, I think we may be ready to hand it over to our panelists to hear what they think.
Yep. Thank you so much, Lauren. That was a very brisk and helpful overview of all the findings in that paper. So now I'd love to get reflections from the panelists. I'm gonna stop sharing my slides so that you can see everybody. And I'm going to ask Sean to go first and talk a little bit about reactions, any thoughts on next steps that the field should be taking or thinking about. Sean?
Thanks very much, Julia, and thanks for folks for joining today. This is a great report, and I appreciate, as a former math teacher and high school assistant principal who is engaged in activities related to these topics, and someone who spends time researching them now, for a chance to reflect on the content of the report and the presentation. A few things stood out to me in this as I reflected both on the report and the ways that I connect to it. The first I'd say is, like, it's good to be reminded that there's nothing magical about the word algebra, right? And so prior examples of trying to, for instance, move to algebra for all helped really underscore that just getting a course called algebra on the books doesn't necessarily lead to the sort of outcomes that were previously known to be correlated with algebra taking by 8th grade. And so it is clear, and we know that algebra is a necessary antecedent to more advanced mathematics. The tools of algebra get used throughout all forms of sort of college preparatory mathematics and applied learning. And this is critical, but I found that in reflecting on the report, the sort of instructional triangle, really, I kept coming back to in my mind, that this intersection of the student, the course content, and the teacher, right, seem to be really, or we know in sort of general settings, are really important to leading to better outcomes. And access is a necessary precursor to being able to engage, and so it's not lost on me that less resourced schools are less able to offer algebra or just a differentiated math course in general in middle school by grade, but that conditional on being able to offer that course, that the content of the course, the resources available to support the content, and then dimensions of the teacher and teachers training really matters. And I feel like the findings from this report underscore that fact, that on average, the teachers who are in the less resourced schools tend to have less robust preparation, which doesn't, and I would caution to conclude anything too strongly about the fact that they don't necessarily have a dedicated math credential. While in many instances, it may be the case that folks who do are better prepared, I'd say that also tends to be related to people having just better teacher preparation in general. So having a better sense of how to manage courses, how to plan lessons, and how to think about interacting with students to support instruction and learning. And I think so that's on the teacher leg of the triangle. On the content side, it occurred to me that less resource schools are also going to have maybe fewer resources, tools available to help support math instruction in general. And I did wonder, to what extent might that inform the sort of more limited and didactic methods that the survey and report demonstrated were being used with higher frequency in the less resource schools, right? So how much of the instructional methods, it could be tied to the training of the teachers, but it might also be connected to the other available resources in those schools. And then I'll add a wondering and reflecting on the sort of role of leaders and what information they use when making, course decisions. A detail that I meant to revisit in the report, and maybe as a point of conversation we can have as a part of this webinar, was whether those results were conditional on the schools offering algebra. So I'm guessing that folks are saying what they do to assign students or to enroll students in algebra, provided they offer it, and then there's a whole bunch of people who don't respond to those questions because their school doesn't offer algebra. But it's not lost on me that if you're not able to offer it, then thinking about how you're going to make course assignments might be less salient. There's also the possibility that it's left to some other default method like counselor decision making, and like greater differentiation of roles within the schools, but did seem to highlight a like disconnect of the instructional leader or the school leader from this sort of instructional triangle, or the interaction between those activities and the school leader themselves. So I think there's plenty of opportunity for further study here. I really think that I would have to think harder about what sorts of questions maybe could be added to the survey to get a sense, but I do think it would be informative to know to what extent people are adding or augmenting course materials, might be offering algebraic topics within the context of other math classrooms, or even the extent to which educators are either constrained or supported to make curricular decisions that might also inform kind of whether and how they can offer these courses. But it does strike me that there's probably then lots of opportunity for intervention or support, or the piloting of or development of programs to help ensure access, because we do find in other research that I've been a part of that getting access is an important precursor to later success, but that access on its own isn't sufficient. So if tomorrow these schools could offer algebra and they could have a highly trained educator to teach that class, kind of whether and how they get additional supports to help prolong their trajectory in college preparatory mathematics in the years beyond that really matters for whether or not folks kind of stay on that path. And I think this is really highlighting the sort of limits at the beginning of that process, or somewhere closer to the middle of that process, which is a critical step in understanding. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sean. And I appreciate you going back to that instructional triangle, which I think is so helpful for thinking about what really matters and where we should be centering our work. Dan, I'm going to turn it over to you. I have lots of questions I could ask Sean, but I think I'll direct it to you next, and then maybe we can kind of discuss as a group. And again, if you do have any questions for our discussants or for the conversation in general, feel free to post them.
Great. Well, I guess I want to begin by underscoring some of what has already been said, which is that algebra is clearly, and I would say algebra in 8th grade is kind of a gateway to a lot of further opportunities. So I think the report is right to be paying attention to this issue about whether schools are offering it, and who is taking it, and what are the kind of conditions that shape those outcomes. I actually have a 8th grade student, so read this report with some interest. I guess I also want to just highlight for the audience two numbers that really jumped out at me. One is that I think it was 20% in high poverty schools and 12% in lower poverty schools of teachers hadn't done student teaching, and that was really quite striking to me that those were the levels. And then another figure that jumped out at me was that 48% of schools don't offer algebra to all students. And I think that the report focuses on the differences between the higher and lower poverty schools, but actually algebra in 8th grade is a very contentious issue in this country that people ought to be paying attention to. There was a big hubbub about algebra in middle schools in San Francisco, for instance, that was pretty interesting. All right. But more on the reactions to the report, I think that when you look at the likelihood that students take algebra in 8th grade, it's kind of a Rorschach test. Is this about the schools and access and the equity of access? Is it about the teachers? Is it about the students themselves? And, I think the report does a nice job of saying, it's really not, it's not an either or, it's sort of a little bit all of the above, and consistent with what you would see from looking at test scores. It's pretty clear that teachers report that a lot of the students in higher poverty schools are more likely to be teaching below grade level math content. And so the issue of student readiness is part of the problem. And yet, if access is also part of the problem, I'm going to return to that. But I think we need to think about these things and what are sort of the policy implications of these different issues. And so I'll begin with the issue of readiness and kind of just advertise the fact that I've done some work looking at kindergarten readiness indicators, and we see huge discrepancies, and it's not just from our work. When you look at research on kindergarten, you see big discrepancies in readiness for math at the point that students enter school. So my personal view is that, it's really good to focus on what's happening in 8th grade, but thinking about it as an 8th grade phenomenon is not the right way to think about it, because the kids have to be progressing. And as Sean mentioned, simply giving them an 8th grade algebra course is not a magic bullet, because states have tried to do that with Algebra for All, and it hasn't been successful because there hasn't been enough preparation in the earlier grades to make them ready for algebra in the 8th grade. So I personally think that we need to have, more early and aggressive intervention if we want to have greater equality when it comes to 8th grade, math course taking across different kinds of schools, different kinds of student subgroups. And then the second thing I want to mention is that the report raises for me a real quandary that schools are in. And that is that, if some students in a school, or many students in a school, are not ready for algebra, there just may not be enough of a scale to hire algebra teachers. And so it's this interesting phenomenon where the students that may be ready for algebra in the 8th grade are likely to be disadvantaged simply by being in schools with other students, greater shares of students that are not ready for algebra in 8th grade. And given the sort of the increased levels of segregation, or the levels of segregation that exist in society, that is a very difficult issue, I think, for schools to tackle on their own when they're trying to make smart decisions about resources. And I'll close with something that I think is going to sound a little bit nutty, given our experience with the pandemic. That when I read the report, thinking about this issue of scale and what's offered, it made me think that this is a good argument for not abandoning the idea of online education. Because I think the same thing, this phenomenon about students being in different places and wanting to try to guarantee access to the level of courses that they are ready for, that exists in this case with algebra in 8th grade, exists in lots of school systems, rural and remote school systems, when it comes to specialized courses or advanced courses. So that rather than think about online education as something we tried, didn't work, which I certainly agree with, and we ought to never do that again, I think we have to think about how this idea might factor into equalizing the opportunities for all students.
Thanks so much, Dan. All right, so I do want to address a few questions that did come up in the Q&A. I know Lauren went through and answered them very efficiently, but I'm wondering, Lauren, Could you speak a little about the analysis for race and ethnicity in particular? That was one question that came up, and you noted there are some trends, but they're not as strong or consistent as the poverty ones. Could you give a little bit more nuance to that? I know we had some different findings in terms of race and ethnicity.
Sure. So what we do is the exact same thing that we did for poverty, in that we split the demographic enrollment of students, the proportion of students enrolled in a school that are either Black or Hispanic, into quartiles. And then we look at the differences and averages across all the survey items across those quartiles by the school, racial and ethnic composition as well. And in the paper, we show those results right next, like we have a figure for every item, and they're right next to the figures for poverty. So you can sort of look at a glance and see if the trends are the same by race and by poverty. And we find some of the same trends, but we find that the trends for race, ethnicity are noisier and are not as consistent. There are a lot more clear trends as you move across the quartiles of poverty than across the quartiles of race and ethnicity. And something that we also do is, in our final version of the model, when we're testing the impacts of poverty, we control for race, and we do the same thing the other way around. In our final models where we're testing the impact of student racial and ethnic composition, we control for poverty. And there are some cases where we see that that final control is dampening or eliminating the effect that we see. So in those cases, the relationship between school poverty and race and ethnicity is very much correlated and also tied to the outcome. And it's difficult for us to sort of, in that case, disentangle which thing is maybe more of a contributing factor. And for that reason, it's great for us to check all of these things in the controls. It helps us understand what else might be going on. But the results that I presented today and that we typically report in the paper are the raw differences without all of the adjusted controls in there, because those are what actually represent the real differences that we see across the country. Whether or not those differences may also be, partially explained by other factors, they do reflect the reality of what students are experiencing. I hope that answers the question.
Dan, you raised that really good question about student readiness, and how we can ensure that we can meet the demand of students who are ready for Algebra 1, as well as support those that are not quite ready. And I know, Marie, you raised that question about whether we address whether there are sufficient courses to meet the demands. The only thing that occurs to me is that there are definitely places that don't offer it at all, right, in 8th grade. And so it's impossible to know how much demand there would be if it was offered. But as Lauren says, it's a great question we don't know the answer to, in terms of, places where it should be offered because there is so much demand. I would say, it should be offered everywhere. And then we can give students the access that they deserve. But I wonder if other panelists have other thoughts on what we should be doing to get students ready for algebra.
I mean, I think that that's a little bit it's a little uncertain because there's lots and lots of research about interventions. Some of them are successful, some of them aren't. But and again, this is maybe more me having had kids go through elementary school recently. That a reflection I have again is that I think it is easy for schools, especially, and for teachers, especially early on in a student's elementary school career, to think that okay, so-and-so is struggling, but they have their whole, K-12 career in front of them to catch up. But what we see from research study after research study after research study is that, of course, some kids catch up, but generally the kids that are far behind when they enter school are likely to be far behind when it gets to, looking at high school outcomes, the probability of going to college or graduating high school. And so I do think that there needs to be some thought about when interventions take place. And it would make sense to me to have interventions take place earlier on before students get to the point where they kind of probably know themselves that they are behind and they are frustrated and maybe acting out and being disruptive and doing things that are not only hurting themselves academically, but maybe disruptive to their peers.
That's such a great answer because, I think there's been like a groundswell of like work to ensure that students have the fundamental reading skills they need and not so much focus on that in the early grades for math. Maybe something we should be doing more of. Sean, do you have any other thoughts?
So I would just like +1 on your last comment, Julia, about having sort of like comparable focus on high quality curriculum leading up to the middle grades when it comes to math preparation. I did just want to like add one other element is that, as work that we've done with Wake County, North Carolina, where they introduced a test-based qualification to get into algebra as a way to equalize access. I saw there was a question in the chat about potential implicit bias, and it was precisely to sidestep some of the role that we know that has played and does play in what students end up in which courses. So in places that offer algebra, coming up with an objective way to ensure access. Students can certainly opt out if they don't feel like they're prepared, but making sure that there's objectivity or a greater degree of objectivity in getting access. And then another thought that I had in thinking about Dan's comment about whether or not algebra is offered in every school and how we might think about providing access. It does strike me that especially precocious independent learners, that online platforms are a way to, create low-cost opportunities. But I also think looking to what the most resourced districts do, and in places where I've lived and worked or studied, they provide buses for kids to go to the school that offers the course. This may not be as plausible in Los Angeles, Chicago, New York, some of the largest districts geographically, but in like a mid-sized district, it might be possible to get a student over to the high school to take algebra with the 9th graders if that's where it's offered. And so I think just thinking hard about how you promote, and not to suggest that anyone is not trying to promote the optimal student outcomes, but thinking hard about how to bring to bear resources to make sure that the folks who are best prepared to pursue that are getting the chance.
Sorry about that interruption. That was my daughter who is home today because it's voting day. Anyway, Dan, sorry. I want to direct the attention to you because I know that you had said about maybe you would answer a question related to Michael's post.
Yeah, well, Mike is a colleague, and he was pointing out that there's actually some Calder work up online about an intervention program in Kentucky. So I do think that there are examples of programs that work, but Julie, as you had said, I think that there's been less systematic focus on early math skills as opposed to focus on early literacy skills. So that's an issue. But just one other thought, and it goes to some of what's in the report about the ways that students are placed into algebra. That there are some studies that focus more at the middle and high school level about defaulting kids into more advanced courses if they look like they are ready based on their test scores to be successful. And I think that having some of those kinds of defaults, you do very well on a test, and we're going to just place you, you can opt out, but we're going to place you in a more advanced course, is a smart idea so that kids who are ready to do, algebra in the 8th grade don't get overlooked.
Yeah, and we know that those, as Sean has demonstrated in some of his work, those automatic enrollment policies are leading to more students in being enrolled and then passing. I think we also want to do more research ourselves on the extent to which, is there a collection of things that would be really helpful, not only automatic enrollment based on test scores, but maybe there's some kind of education counselors and teachers can have, so that if they are giving recommendations, they're thinking about the right things and giving those recommendations. Because I agree with something raised in the chat about implicit bias. It's present all the time, and sometimes we don't even know that, and maybe directing students in the wrong way. I did want to ask one final question, since we have another 5 minutes. And it's something that Lauren and I have gone back and forth about. Schools have limited resources, especially higher poverty schools. Given these limited resources, what could be the best way to focus our energy in those high poverty schools? What could give us the greatest impact in terms of maybe leading to more students taking and passing algebra in particular?
Sean, you want to lead in? Yeah.
Well, so I'm going to borrow from an idea that you raised earlier, Dan, possibly right before the call. I mean, like in terms of benefit per dollar, I think like if you could entice teachers that are particularly strong to stay by offering them, the sort of financial or benefit-based incentives that we know would be offered to competing school districts, having someone who is particularly good at instructing students in mathematics and being able to benefit from them across, let's say, 6th, 7th, and 8th grades, strike me as a like one person solution, at least in some instances, to being able to meet a lot of students where they are in terms of their math preparation. And that might just take a modest increase above and beyond what it costs schools currently to do that. Certainly less than buying a new curriculum or finding a university partner or things. But I'll let Dan weigh in here too.
Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna double down on what Sean just said with a modification. The doubling down is that human capital. We know that the differences in the impact that teachers have on students are profound, and it's reflected in the report that there are big differences in the qualifications of teachers across schools based on poverty. And even if we know that there are big differences on average, but we also know there's more churn of teachers in high poverty schools, and the churn is bad. So I think that thinking about ways to try to, and a salary is a natural one, to try to encourage greater stability, more human capital in the schools where students are struggling, is a natural response to realize the equality of educational opportunity. And then the modification that I suggested is just to, and I'm a broken record on this, but to do it before middle school. So I think that we don't want to think about it just in middle school, because for many students, middle school will be too late. We need to think about that for the feeders into the middle schools where we see these results.
Well, yeah, I want to add something.
I just wanted to add one additional. I'm just like sitting here in a northeastern state, having worked in another northeastern state where like, the ability to modify the provisions of contracts can be limited. And so one additional thought is to think about like potentially peer tutoring or near peer tutoring options if you have students in high schools or in the community, greater community at large with universities or things, to help bring or augment local human capital by bringing folks in to the school day or after school might be another way to kind of address that. And if what Dan and I are proposing is not on the table.
That's great. Great ideas for increasing the quality and the quantity of math instruction that students get. Well, thank you so much for taking the time today. To our panelists and also those of you that are audience members on the call. We will post this recording on our website in another few weeks, but we really appreciate you taking the time to learn from all the great information that we shared today. Take care. Have a great evening.
Great to be with you.